Good evening. Welcome back to the Deep 404. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg has been in Washington, has been in the States, and he has been repeating a line which has been said by a number of leading Western figures of late. His line has been that for a fraction of the US defence budget, we have destroyed and degraded much of the Russian army. This parallels with something which Lord David Cameron, former Prime Minister of England, who's now the current British Foreign Secretary, he said the same thing recently, and added on to his statement that this had been a great investment for the United States, that it hadn't cost them a great deal, and they degraded the Russian capability and the Russian military, but also there hadn't been the loss of a single American life. And he seemed to completely forget the hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians whose lives have been disrupted or lost during this conflict. But there's a flaw in what they're saying here. I mean, just if you go and actually look at any of the economic data that's coming out about Russia and read reports about what's happening there in terms of their unemployment rates and their labour shortage rates, the Russian economy is booming domestically. They've moved to a war footing. They are producing a lot, and everyone seems as employed there in Russia. So Jens, following the party line, towing the line, following the narrative, but not really demonstrating a true accounting of what has happened and what has happened for this fraction of the American defence budget. Some could say that a large amount of American taxpayer money has been spent, and if the goal for spending that was to defeat Russia and see Ukraine become a strong independent nation, then that money has been wasted, and wasted poorly. On the front line of Ukraine, the fighting is continuing along the front line. The Russians are reportedly having success in a number of areas with the use of Lancet drones. These Lancet drones and FPV drones are doing enough damage to Ukrainian servicemen and equipment that the Russian tanks are then being given a break and being able to move in, assume positions, and push back Ukrainian positions. So it seems that the FPV and Lancet drones they're the game changer that people have been talking about so often through this conflict. They really do seem to be the technology that we've seen for the first time used to an advantage, and a strong advantage in terms of tactical success within a military conflict, a modern military conflict. Now, of course, the topic of General Zaluzhny, I need to cover this off. So over the last 24 to 48 hours, there seemed to be a large swell of reports, rumours, apparently sources indicating that they were aware that President Zelensky had fired General Zaluzhny. Now, it seems as though that isn't exactly what has happened. It seems as though that is perhaps what President Zelensky had intended to do, had wanted to do, had perhaps even signed a decree that would occur, but that doesn't seem to have been followed through with. Now, there is some suggestion that this may be because the Americans have stepped in and said that they don't want Zaluzhny gone. Now, that could be for a number of reasons. The American military administration has dealt with General Zaluzhny for the last 2 years. He's a known quantity for them. If he's replaced by someone like Kirilo Budanov, who even to someone like me, just a remote observer, seems to be an interesting character and someone who would be an unusual selection for a commander of the armed forces, given that he has no command experience before in military command. He has military intelligence command, but they're different domains. So perhaps that's the reason the Americans want to keep a known quantity in there. Perhaps the Americans are concerned about what might happen if Zaluzhny were to be fired and how that might upset the apple cart. There are Ukrainian polls released in December, which suggests that up to 88% of Ukrainians said they trusted General Zaluzhny more than those who trusted President Zelensky. 88% of Ukrainians reportedly trusted Zaluzhny, 62% trusted Zelensky. So if he were to lose his role, as I've said before, and I'll include a link in the description to this if you want to go and check out this video I did recently. It looks something like this, if you're looking for it. It is, are we about to see Zaluzhny pushed out, or are we about to see a military coup in Ukraine? There are, and I discussed it in that video, there are a number of reasons why that could be a real possibility. Coups happen, military coups happen all the time, and if you are the guy with the guns and the tanks, often you can have your way if you are trying to enact a coup. So it might be these reasons. Perhaps the Americans have come in and said, we don't want to run the risk of that. We're not really liking the options that you're offering us to replace the commander. So for those reasons, don't fire him now. Now, again, I can't confirm that the Americans have been involved in this, but certainly, being the financial backers of Ukraine's war effort, they would have some say in who is holding those leadership positions within the Zelensky government and military. Sorry, I lost my mouse. There we go. The Ministry of Defence, so again, just talking through what's happening in Ukraine in terms of military there. The Ministry of Defence numbers, I'll run through these quickly. Now I won't go into great detail on this, but I'll just tick these off. There's quite a bit to cover off tonight. I'll get into some Middle East stuff and quite a bit of European and US stuff later on, but I'll just cover off the Ukraine stuff up front. In the Kupiansk direction, reports are here, a lot of fighting around Sinkovka still. Sinkovka, an area which is close to Kupiansk and has been a tough one for the Russians to be able to capture due to the geography. So the Ukrainians holding land just to the east of Sinkovka on the hills there and in a forested area, which gives them some level of protection and ability to move relatively undetected, whereas the Russians coming in from the east having to move west across flat and bare plains, so leaving them very exposed. Some reports this week, though, that the Russians are making advances on the area of Sinkovka. In the Kupiansk direction, the Russian Ministry of Defence reporting for the last 24 hours reports that 140 Ukrainian troops have been killed or wounded in this area. Moving down to Krasny Liman, again, fighting seems to be around Yampolovka and Chervonaya Dibrova in the Lugansk People's Republic. 290 troops reportedly killed or wounded for the Ukrainians in Krasny Liman area today. And a number of armoured fighting vehicles and tanks reportedly destroyed. Moving down to the Donetsk direction, where the Yug group of forces of the Russian armed forces are fighting. Fighting seems to have been centred around Krasnoye, Andriivka, Novomykhailovka. Again, this is an area where there's been heavy use of the TOS-1, the big heavy flamethrower systems, and they are reported as have been used again. Allowing the Russians to take advantages and opportunities and allowing them to move forward pushing their lines forward and their positions forward. The reports here from the Russian Ministry of Defence, now the Russian Ministry of Defence indicate that they get these numbers on Ukrainian killed and wounded, these estimates based upon intercepts of communications. I imagine some of it is done with visual sighting and the ability to move into an area and sort of see the people that are wounded or have been killed in those areas. But reportedly, they are able to, at some level, intercept these communications. Now, this may not mean that they're intercepting communications all across the front line. It may simply be that somewhere at a higher level where these numbers are rolled up to, they may have some source that's providing them information about those numbers there. I don't know the details of it. But in Donetsk, 310 troops reportedly killed and wounded on the Ukrainian side today. One Polish-made Crab self-propelled artillery piece destroyed, and 2 M-Star-B howitzers destroyed in Donetsk. In South Donetsk, around the areas of Hugledar and Konstantinovka, 60 Ukrainian troops reportedly killed and wounded. 2 UK-made FH-70 howitzers destroyed, and 1 D-30 gun reportedly destroyed in the South Donetsk region. Moving south and westward into Zaporozhye. In this area, intense fighting going on around Robotny. Now, Robotny or Robotino, fighting has been going on there for months now, for like a solid 6 months of fighting in this area. The Russians are now slowly starting to push the Ukrainians back up out of Verbova and Robotny. The reports are of 40 Ukrainian troops lost, either killed or wounded, 1 Akatsiya self-propelled artillery system destroyed, and 1 D-30 howitzer neutralized in that area. Finally, in Kherson region, down where Kherson on the Dnieper River, here the reports are losses of 45 Ukrainian troops and 2 D-30 howitzers. So for the previous 24 hours of fighting, if these numbers are correct or near being correct, then the Ukrainian losses, according to the Russian Ministry of Defense, are 795, nearly 800 men. And in terms of artillery, 10 pieces lost, 2 of them being self-propelled pieces. Pardon me. For those of you who follow the show, you know that of recent weeks, there seems to have been some uptick in the number of self-propelled pieces of artillery being destroyed. Exactly what that means, I can't say exactly. I have my suspicions that it may mean that the Ukrainians have lost enough air defense, enough ANTPQ counter-battery radars, that they are now losing the counter-battery fight, that the Russians are beginning to overpower them and are not only knocking out the stationary pieces of artillery, but are also now capable of destroying the mobile self-propelled pieces. And that's why we're seeing numbers of these now being reported as being destroyed. Moving off the front line, but still related to it, a Ukrainian channel, Telegram channel, that I often read and gather information from. The information seems to be reliable, and it's certainly not what you would consider to be a pro-Ukrainian channel. It is a Ukrainian channel. They seem to have some source on the inside. They often talk about their source in the OP, which is the Office of the President, and the information that they give out does seem to often bear fruit and be indicative of what may actually really be happening. It's certainly not propaganda trying to sell a rosy picture. Anyhow, in one of the brief translated pieces that I saw today, and I must admit the translation of this one isn't great, but it talks about the hospital stay of persons being aged 18 to 25 years old must now be notified to the Military Registration and Enlistment Office within 3 days of their admission for treatment. So reading between the lines here, it was a small piece and it was not translated well, but I get the impression that what they are suggesting here is now that if you are between the age of 18 and 25 and you enter hospital for any reason, that will be alerted to the Military Registration and Enlistment Office in the area in which the hospital is and where presumably you live, and action will be taken upon that, perhaps to visit you in hospital, investigate what you are hospitalized for, and if you are someone who would fit the ever-widening criteria of someone who should be mobilized to fight, you may find yourself not going home, but perhaps going to the front line. I think that is what this report is trying to suggest is beginning to happen. They've also spoken about their embassies, Ukrainian embassies overseas, will not carry out any emission or supply of passports, perhaps, unless the person in question has military registration documents. So it seems as though Ukrainian embassies who overseas and European nations, perhaps where people from Ukraine have moved to, if they require any assistance from the Ukrainian embassy in that European country in which they're living, that they may now not be able to get that unless, this is men, this is saying if they are between the ages of 18 to 60-year-old men, that no consular actions will be carried out for them unless they have with them or in the presence of military registration documents. So it seems as though you'll get no help unless they have papers indicating that you are could be military registered, and in which case perhaps they may try to entice you back to Ukraine. Again, I'm reading between the lines. They were very brief pieces coming from a reliable channel which often tries to get out information like this which might be somewhat unsavoury about what is really going on. Now, the TCC, which I believe is the Military Registration and Enlistment Office, is what the Ukrainians in this channel refer to it as, the TCC. They are saying now that the TCC may go to court to impose the following restrictions on a person liable for military service: seizure of bank accounts and valuables in banks, restrictions on travel abroad of Ukraine, and the restriction of the rights to drive a vehicle. So this, now, it doesn't indicate when this might be used, if you've been requested to go and you've denied that request, or if this is simply now something that may start happening to people to draw them in that they may simply say, okay, this person is between 18 and 60, we'd like to mobilise them, we are going to seize their bank accounts. That will cause them to come into the bank and speak to us, and perhaps we'll have someone waiting there for them, and we will then be able to actually mobilise them and make them join the military. This channel also goes on to say that with the bill that has been introduced for mobilisation and all the discussion that's been going on about it, this has been done, and the bill itself has just been introduced to give the illusion of democracy. They said, though, in fact, no one really changed the bill. Only the conscription of disabled people was removed, which was a very unusual piece and a telling piece to be included originally, that Ukraine was looking to be able to legally conscript those who were disabled. But what this channel again seems to be saying now is that this whole bill and discussion of the bill being brought in is purely to give the illusion of democracy. All other strict norms were in place, and it gives the indication that these things are going on anyhow, whether or not this bill may be in place. I may be reading too much into it, but that's what it seems to be indicating to me. Finally, they also mention one last point, which is there is one hiccup, one problem with the mobilisation that the military of Ukraine and President Zelensky would like to implement, and that is that they have no money for mobilisation. And here I believe they're referring to a lack of funds for two crucial elements of the mobilisation. One is they're running out of money to be able to pay those members of the TCC, the Registration and Enlistment Office, those officers who go out and actually look to mobilise and take people off the street and get them into the armed forces. And for those people who become mobilised, they have no money to pay their military salary. They may even be reaching the point where they're struggling to pay for other necessities for those in the military. That's not specified here, but there is some concern about that with the lack of funding coming from Western nations and the current state of the Ukrainian economy and its limited ability to be able to trade. Speaking of that, another Ukrainian channel has suggested that there are problems coming for Ukraine originating out of France, relating to the EU, and that French President Emmanuel Macron has called for the EU to take action against Ukrainian agricultural exports. Reportedly, while at a press conference in Stockholm with Swedish Prime Minister Ulf Kristersson, Macron said that he intends to discuss on February the 1st with the head of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, the adoption of measures regarding the import of agricultural products from Ukraine in connection with the destabilisation of the EU market. Now remember, this is all on the backdrop, and if you're not aware of it, it's because France has some amazing powers to be able to suppress its domestic problems on mainstream media. But right now, there are massive farmer-led blockades of Paris, areas of Paris and markets where thousands of farmers have come out in protest over all sorts of things, wages, costs, subsidies, and things like this, the ability to compete within the EU. President Macron has said, "I will ask for specific things for our farmers. Clear measures are needed regarding imports from Ukraine, since we are observing, in terms of the scale and quality of this import, factors that are destabilising the European market. This applies to the import of chickens and grain." So this sounds to me like the farmers' protest in France is working. It's applying pressure to Macron, and Macron is now looking for the easy pickings, and the easy pickings are to say, well, where we might have allowed Ukrainian products in before, they're not a member of the EU, stop it. He can say this now, try to appease the farmers, make them happy, make them back off, and the pressure they must be causing him by blockading towns. There are videos on social media, X and Telegram, if you look for them, where you will see French farmers are now turning motorways into fields. They're getting trucks with dirt, they're dumping it, and then they're spreading it out, and whether they're actually sowing it yet, I don't know. But their protests are taking on a very colourful and theatrical nature, and it's quite interesting to watch. This is obviously putting pressure on Macron, who is now saying, okay, we can't deal with these Ukrainian imports coming in anymore. It's part of the problem. It's probably the one thing that I can ask the EU to do, which might help me gain some ground with the farmers. So these sort of challenges are making it difficult for the Ukrainian economy to be able to export goods, to be able to generate revenue, to be able to pay people to fight. And that's a real problem for them. Hungary and Slovakia are having problems in the EU. Hungary in particular. Hungary, the Prime Minister of Hungary, Viktor Orban, has come out and openly said that he's being sabotaged and held to ransom and blackmail by the EU. And the EU are effectively saying, we will cut all funding to Hungary, EU funding to Hungary, if you do not get on board and support the 50 billion euros that we want to give to Ukraine over the next 3 years. Orban is saying, I don't want to do that. I want us to understand where it's going. I want to understand what it's being spent on and why we're giving so much money and what's the point and all those sort of questions he's wanting to ask. Those questions apparently can no longer be asked in the EU without the risk of serious repercussions to your nation. Now, I've mentioned Slovakia because their President Robert Fico, newly elected there, he has been a supporter of Hungary and Viktor Orban's fight within the EU. The EU have already raised a vote count to see who would agree with stripping Viktor Orban's ability to vote and his veto ability. Fico has said that he wouldn't support such a thing. So this begins to then raise the question of, would Hungary and would possibly Slovakia consider leaving the EU and perhaps joining the Russian Eurasian Economic Union, the EAEU or the EEU? The EEU is an economic forum of post-Soviet states. There's 5 of them: Armenia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Russia. Currently, they have 183 million people covered in their populations and a gross domestic product of $2.4 trillion. So, Hungary could move. Let's take a look at our map here. Make this a little bigger. So here we have Ukraine here in the green here, the Black Sea, Romania, this pink area between Hungary and the Black Sea here. So Hungary's kind of isolated from Belarus and Russia, but in theory, it would be difficult for it because it is effectively cut off here. However, there is some support through Serbia for Russia. There's talk that they could consider leaving the EU. It would be a major economic impact to Hungary if they did do that, and not something that I think they are wishing to do at this stage. If they were to do that, that would likely then lead to them leaving NATO. They could then move to perhaps the CSTO, the Collective Security Treaty Organisation. This is an organisation of nations involving Russia, where they are a collective for security, political, military cooperation, foreign policy coordination on international and regional security issues, the establishment of multilateral cooperation mechanisms, including a military component. So this is like a Russo version of a NATO, that type of thing. One interesting thing, Hungary did retain the forint as its currency, didn't adopt the euro as its main currency. So if it were to, say, move out of the EU at some stage, it still has its currency operating there. Right, let's just talk a little bit about the Middle East. Now we'll just move there for a little bit, and of course the big thing here after the attack on Tower 22, the base located just inside the Jordanian border with Syria, the US response and what Joe Biden is going to do there. Now Joe Biden has met with his advisors and the heads of the Pentagon, and he has reportedly made his decision as to what he will do. I will include a link to yesterday's video, or if you look on the channel, you will see it, where I cover this off in a lot more detail. The likely response from the United States has been suggested by Secretary of State Anthony Blinken that it may be multifaceted. It may occur over a period of time. It may not just be one strike, and that all options are being considered. Those options are things like striking Iran in Iran, within its national borders, striking Iranian assets which are outside of Iran, or perhaps striking those militias, those groups of fighters who are Iranian aligned or supported, receive perhaps weapons or funding or support of various kinds from Iran, striking them within Syria and Iraq. There is still some confusion about the story, exactly what has happened. I cover that off all in yesterday's episode. I won't go into that in great detail here, but if you're interested in this, there is some interesting points around this as to where the attack really occurred and why it might have been originally said it was Jordan, and then it was Tanf in Syria, then it was back to Jordan, all of those type of things. Iran has told the United States through intermediaries that if the US is to strike Iranian soil directly, that Tehran and Iran will itself hit back at American assets in the Middle East. And that will, the Iranians have said, draw the two of them into direct conflict. So the Iranians effectively saying, look, if you hit us, because we didn't do this, the Iranians have said their statement on their position on the attack is that we were not involved, we did not coordinate it. Those other paramilitary groups, whatever you want to call them, Iranian-backed rebels, or those groups operate independently. They don't necessarily tell us what they're going to do, and we don't direct them in what they're going to do. Yes, we may support them, we're aware of them, we're aware you have troubles with them, but we're not directing them. That's been the Iranian position on this. But they've said, if you strike us on our soil, we will engage in your bases across the region, and that will not be something that you want. It's not something that we want. The Guardian, a British newspaper, it is reporting that Iranian Foreign Minister Hossein Amir Abdollahian, he said he's been saying that he's sort of confident. He knows that the Americans recognise that a political solution is required to end the carnage that is occurring in the Middle East, and that is going to grow if they don't take a political solution to this particular topic. He said that diplomacy is moving forward on this path. Benjamin Netanyahu is nearing the end of his criminal political life. What seems to be most likely is that an attack by the US will be on positions inside of Syria at this stage. Now, the US have bases in Syria, Tanf, this one which has been embroiled in this whole issue. It houses reportedly about 200 special ops forces. It's about 25 kilometres inside Syria from the Jordanian border. The American forces there, they are an occupying force within Syria. The ruling leader, the government of Syria, has not asked the American forces to be within that country and establish military base there. But it seems likely that that is where it will happen if there are attacks, most likely in that area or possibly in Iraq at some of these Iranian-funded groups in Iraq. There are a couple of things that need to be considered, I guess, if de-escalation is going to happen in this area. Now, not directly related to the attacks on the American base, but in terms of resolving the issue between Israel and Gaza, Hamas in that area. One of them is the Palestinian Authority. So the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, who is the leader, ideally he is suggesting that they would become a controlling party over the Gaza region if Hamas were to lose control there. The Americans don't seem to like this idea. So the Americans at this stage, and certainly the Israelis, feel that that's not a solution they are happy with within Gaza, and more likely the Israelis would retain control over the Gaza Strip. Now, that's something that needs to be resolved before this conflict there will end. And at this stage, I don't see any likely resolution coming for that. Another thing here is that the other Arab nations surrounding Israel, their relationship with Israel after this conflict needs to be considered and needs to be managed somehow. For example, Saudi Arabia was on the path towards normalization with Israel just prior to the October 7 attack. In fact, some people suggested that perhaps the timing of the October 7 attack was necessitated by the impending normalization of relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel. And it was thought that if that did occur, then any hope for the Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank of some sort of a two-state solution would be lost, as it would be seen that the Arab nations were just now supporting and recognizing Israel, and the things would move forward that way. That normalization process, of course, was derailed due to the Israeli response to the Hamas attacks. But that is something around that area which also needs to be resolved. What is the ongoing relationship between Egypt and Israel, Jordan and Israel, Lebanon and Israel, Saudi Arabia and Israel, the Houthis in Yemen and Israel going to be, even if the Gaza situation cools down? Is that actually going to be something which they will say, okay, we're now going to back off as well? Or has it gone too far? Has it reached a point where even if Israel was to say today, we'll stop bombing Gaza immediately and let all the medical aid in immediately, that these other areas might go, that's okay, but we're not happy with the situation. Now things must change. Two-state solution, perhaps, or some other options. In terms of some positive news from the area, there are reports that the the ceasefire talks relating to another hostage swap may be proceeding positively. William Burns, the CIA director, has reportedly been sent at his level to talk with Mossad, his equivalent within Mossad, in Qatar, to talk to the Qatari leadership of Hamas to see if they can broker a deal to allow a ceasefire to start, to allow for a hostage swap. So the Israelis get some of their hostages returned, the Palestinians get some of theirs returned, and there is a ceasefire for that duration. Now Hamas has called for a permanent ceasefire. The Israelis have said, nope, they won't accept any sort of talk of a permanent ceasefire. There may be a brief ceasefire while this hostage swap goes on. That, at least over the last couple of days, the reports have been that it seems to be proceeding, which at least is good. If there is some sort of a ceasefire for a period of time in Gaza, that is good news. Ideally, finding a way to extend it, of course, is the goal. That doesn't seem to be something that's going to be easy to do here. There is the topic of the UN Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA. It has lost funding from most major Western nations due to Israeli allegations that 12 of its workers were somehow involved in the October 7 attacks. Now, this organisation provides aid to people. It provides aid to people in Gaza. It seems to be one of the largest that do that. So by stopping funding to them is going to impact their ability to provide aid to the people in Gaza. The allegations, and I will put my hand up now and say that I have not read into this deeply, so I don't have all of the details, but at this stage, my understanding is that this funding has been stopped based upon allegations raised by Israel that there were 12 people out of this organisation of tens of thousands of people, I imagine around the world, thousands at least, that 12 of them were somehow involved in and participated in the October 7th attacks. If this bears fruit, and they were involved and heavily involved and led to deaths and all that sort of thing, then yes, some sort of response against the UNRWA makes sense, but perhaps it isn't to defund it so that it can't carry out the good work it was doing. The response might be an internal investigation and a tightening of vetting programs or something like that for people that work there, that type of thing. If, however, it turns out that these allegations are allegations and there isn't good evidence to back this up, and I'm not saying this is the case, but if this were to turn out to be the case, then this would be an example of cruel and unusual punishment upon the civilian populace of Gaza if this has been an attempt in bad faith to stop aid to that area. And I'm not saying that is what's happening. This will all come out in the wash over time. But I'll just put it on record that I've had the thought that at this stage, the funding has stopped based upon some allegations. I'm not aware that there has been any thorough investigation done to determine the exact nature and all of this. And even if that had been done, if stopping of funding is the correct response to that. As I say, the correct response might be to stop, tighten up the ability for people to join the organisation who might then cause problems for the organisation, not necessarily stop the organisation from being able to do good work in terms of funding people. But as I said, I haven't gone deep into that one. The Houthis in the Red Sea, they appear to be prepared for a long fight. Mohammed Nasser al-Atifi, who's a representative of the Houthis and the Ansar Allah group, He said that they are prepared for a long confrontation with the US and the UK. He says, "Our revolutionary leadership and the Supreme Political Council have taken all necessary steps, so we are ready for a long confrontation with the forces of tyranny. The Americans, the British, and those who coordinated with them must realise the strength of Yemen's sovereign decision, and that it is not a matter of discussion or debate." This was reportedly publicised on Al Masirah television, the Houthi-owned television station in Yemen. So the Houthis, again, I've talked about this as being, I may even have a link to a video on earlier I've done this, and this is a great example of asymmetric warfare, how they're able to just enact so much leverage globally with so little resources, with some assault rifles, some men, some speedboats. That's enough for them to be doing this. They also have some missiles, which they're using as well, but with just the men, the gun, and the speedboats, they have been able to exert massive pressure upon the US. Unfortunately, at this stage, it does not seem to have really brought to bear the result that they want, which is the US to actively work to stop Israel bombing Gaza. And this is what the Houthis want, if you're not clear. The Houthis have been very open about this. They want to stop the bombing, the attacks on the people in Gaza. They want the Israelis to stop that, and they are going to enact pressure upon the shipping through the Red Sea until that happens. Originally, they were only targeting Israeli-linked boats. However, since the US and the UK made the decision not to talk with them about this, but to bomb them, they expanded that. So that's now Israeli, US and UK ships cannot travel safely through the Gulf of Aden and through the Red Sea because of the risk of the Houthis attacking those boats. And they have been carrying out many attacks, about 30 or more over the last couple of months. Finally, though, just to give an idea of the Israeli position on what's going on there at the moment, Yoav Gallant, who's the Israeli defense minister, he is now saying that Israel is prepared for a war in the north, and that will be devastating for both Hezbollah and Lebanon. "We are prepared for war, and eventually, when our patience wears thin, we will need to take strong action to impose quiet on the northern borders for the security of Israeli residents." The possibility of reaching a political settlement with Lebanon is running out, and as a result, we may end up resorting to military action. He has said this in the Yediot Ahronot newspaper. So, Israel Defense Minister not really looking to extend an olive branch or to find a way to resolve things. He is, it seems as though he is saying, Hezbollah, Lebanon, you had better do as we say, or we will start a fight with you. As I've said many times, if Hezbollah become fully involved in a conflict with Israel, that will be a very different picture to what is happening with Hamas in Gaza. Hamas in Gaza are very limited in what they're able to do. They had a limited amount of supplies on October the 7th, and they have not seen those supplies in terms of military aid increase for them. So they're running on dwindling supplies. And they are effectively sieged. So, fuel, food, water, medical supplies, all of those things, and armaments, they're in a declining graph there. Hezbollah, however, are not. Hezbollah are still able to receive support through any of the nations who wish to support them can access and provide that to them through Lebanon. So they are also a much larger force. They have a much more highly skilled and trained force. They have a large arsenal of missiles and rockets that they could launch at Israel, reaching all areas of Israel, causing more damage than what the Hamas fighters were able to do with their limited capabilities. Quick one on Africa, and then let's talk a little bit about the United States. In Africa, Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso have this week announced immediately that they are leaving ECOWAS. So ECOWAS is the Economic Community of West African States. They've announced that they want to waste no time with their withdrawal. By the legislation of it, they actually remain in it for a year. But I imagine if they've had enough and they stop sending people to it and they stop sending funds to it, then they don't really care. They're out. The ECOWAS is a regional political and economic union of 15 countries located in West Africa, which has now just lost 3 here. They have accused ECOWAS of implementing inhumane sanctions in order to reverse the coup in each nation. So all of these nations over the last 2 years have suffered under coups. Well, 3. I shouldn't say suffered under coups. They have experienced coups. As to whether they've suffered, you'd have to ask the people of these nations themselves how they feel about the coup. But they're saying ECOWAS has implemented inhumane sanctions in order to reverse the coups. ECOWAS would like to see them remain there, of course, because of a weakening for their organisation if they leave. Doesn't look great that they're leaving because they believe the organisation itself was being implementing inhumane sanctions on them. But what this does do is add to the vacuum within Africa, which has been left by the French, specifically and primarily by the French, and which is rapidly being filled by Russia and China, but predominantly Russia, it seems. In each of those 3 nations, Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, and the Central African Republic, the Russians are growing strong military and economic ties with them. In the Central African Republic, to such an extent that they are setting aside land to be barracks for 10,000 soldiers, and they want the Russians to come in here and put soldiers in there and to train them and teach them to protect themselves and that type of thing. So as these nations are exiting and pushing out the French and the US and doing so with a bad taste in their mouth, the Russians are moving in and playing the game very smartly, cleverly it seems, moving in and just offering good deals, support, growth, infrastructure, military support if that's what you want. Great, let's partner. We're not going to try and colonise you. We'll partner with you here. If you want us to be here, great. We love a foothold in Africa. Makes sense. And let's trade and deal with you for those resources that you have that we might need. As other Western nations are shutting themselves off to Russia, Russia is opening up doors throughout Africa. All right, the US, I've got a little picture here that I wanted to show. The United States, US border crossings. So the border crossings, illegal border crossings and arrests for such crossings from Mexico reached the highest on record in December 2023. The Border Patrol, which is a federal agency which is tasked with managing border security, and this is what part of the challenge with Texas at the moment is about, is that Texas wants its own National Guard and its state forces to maintain the border with Mexico because it doesn't believe that the federal border control under the control of Joe Biden is actually doing any sort of job to protect their border from these undocumented people travelling in. Now, as I've said before, I'm not against people travelling into other nations at all. I just think that if you are a nation, you want to have some control over who is coming into your country. That seems fair enough to be able to say, hey, we've had a look at you. You seem to be the leader of a violent gang. We don't want you to come in. You know, all your mates, you can stay out. You, looks like you've been through hardship. You've maybe been beaten up by these gang members, but not affiliated with them. Come on in. You know, you want to be able to do that sort of thing. And if you think, oh no, everyone should be able to come in, there shouldn't be anything like that, then you're living in a fantasy land. The world just doesn't work that way. Anyhow, so with these crossings, the Border Patrol totaled 250,000 arrests on the Mexican border in December. 250,000 arrests made in December, which is up 31% from November, the month before, and 13% from December 2022. So maybe there's a cyclical thing to this. But it's up on the previous December, and it's up 30% on November. Tucson, Arizona was the busiest corridor for these crossings. And so these were arrests. It's 250,000 arrests. Now, when those people are arrested, I don't believe that they are all sent back. Some of them are arrested and are allowed to go into America. And these are just the people who have been detained and arrested. There are other people making it through who aren't being detained and arrested. So what the total number for the month is, who can say? But that's a large number of people coming into the country. The second most popular area for this to happen, after Tucson, Arizona, where there were 80,000 arrests in December, is Del Rio in Texas, where Governor Greg Abbott is having this issue with the federal government. There were 71,000 arrests. And then a distant third is San Diego, where there were nearly 6,000 Chinese immigrants arrested, undocumented Chinese immigrants. Between 2017 and 2022, so in that 5-6 year period, the undocumented population within America for Middle Eastern people of Middle Eastern origin who were undocumented, that number grew over those 6 years by 40,000 people. The number of undocumented people in America, living in America, undocumented, originating from Africa, grew between 2017 and 2022 by 100,000 people. And 22% of US foreign-born population, so 22% of the people living in the United States who are born in another nation, so almost a quarter, are unauthorized, unknown people who have immigrated without coming through some process or policy, have just got across the border into the country. Now, obviously, the bulk of these people, they're never ever going to cause a problem. They're going to live there, they're going to get jobs, they're going to grow families. Ideally, one day they'll get citizenship. And I think that that's a good thing that most of them will do, and I think that most people are happy with that approach. The concern is for those people who don't have that intent, and the fact that you have no way of telling them apart. It's just, if someone's undocumented, it's like, well, what do we do? How do we know what they're here for? We have no ability to understand that. That seems to be the big problem. That seems to be the big challenge that Greg Abbott is having, where he's saying he's actually called an emergency last September in the state of Texas, and is doing this, which is causing this conflict with Joe Biden and the federal border patrol. And this is all tied up into the money for Israel and Ukraine. $16 billion for Israel, $64 billion for Ukraine. It's tied up, it's on hold, because the Republicans understand that the reason that Joe Biden and the Democrats want to have a porous border and do this is because most of these people will end up voting as a Democrat. In some states in the United States, you don't need to provide ID to vote. This is my understanding. I may be wrong. Tell me if I'm wrong about this. This sounds ridiculous, but it seems as though you can turn up and vote without actually proving who you are. Now, how big a loophole that makes, I don't know. Like, maybe it means that I could impersonate someone who I know is not going to vote because they're out of state, then they're unlikely to vote, but I could say I'm them and I could vote for them. Or I could maybe vote for someone who's just died recently, and sneak that vote in. Or, and this, I need to research this, or if you're from the US, just tell me in the comments, does it mean that some people can actually vote with no identification at all and just vote? Like, if I snuck in there tomorrow, could I vote? If that is the case somewhere in America, that's ridiculous. You really should have an understanding of the right to vote. If you believe you have a right to vote, you've earned it somehow by living in a community or a society, then you would expect that you would gain that vote through being a valid part of that society, that the society has agreed to be part of it. And if you're not, if you're just some random outsider like me turning up and voting, does that make sense? Maybe that's not the case. But the idea of not proving who you are when you vote does seem to lead to the ability to place fraudulent votes for people. Anyhow, so yeah, just some information on why this is considered a problem in the United States. To get a feel for these numbers, why Texas has a problem with it. Of course, a lot of people too who turn up, they turn up unskilled. A lot of them will be turning up with no ability to speak the English language or Spanish. And so they are there living in America then effectively reliant upon America to provide them welfare so that they can survive in the country. If they're unable to find a job, if they don't know anyone there, if they're unable to find work, all those sort of things, then again, people in Texas are saying, well, why should our tax dollars pay for these people to be fed, to be housed, to be imprisoned if they get caught for something, whatever it might be? There are just costs associated with that. And again, you would think that you want to be able to say, yep, we want people to come into the country. Of course, everyone wants people to come into their countries, but we'd love to be able to just know about them, bring them in, ask them some things, tell them some things, get them set up the right way, help them, work in the community and find jobs, all those kind of things. So that's what's leading to this, and the fact that the Democrats like this because they see it as being an avenue for them to get future voters. There have been Democratic senators earlier this year talking about the fact that they would raise a bill and support a bill where if you were a completely undocumented person in the United States, but you decided to join the armed forces, you would be granted citizenship. So me, random guy, turns up in America, says, oh, I'm undocumented, but I'll join the army. Okay, you're now an American citizen. Well, maybe I don't really give a rat's ass about America, I'm not from America, but you want me to go and fight for you? I mightn't be the best soldier that you're going to find. I'm just saying, these are some of the things, yet you can imagine how this sways people in that situation to vote Democrat. Oh, I want to vote for the party that says if I go and join the army, and they'll let me join the army now, which they wouldn't, but they'll let me join the army and I get citizenship, fuck yeah, I'll vote for those guys. That's what's happening here. That's why it's such a big issue and a big debate. One last thing on CI Director William Burns. He has said that China is the biggest threat to the United States. China is a bigger threat than the immediate Russian threat, and that they have doubled their spending, so this is in the CIA, intelligence spending, and focus has been doubled in the last 2 years on China. So whatever they spend on China, he's saying they've now doubled that. They're really putting a focus on it. His counterpart in Britain, the head of MI6, Richard Moore, such a great British name, Richard Moore. Richard Moore, he has said, we now devote more resources to China than any other mission. So, just interesting. We've got all this conflict in the Middle East. So we've got Iran, we've got Russia, but the CIA, the one that they're really focused on, and this of course makes sense, and I've got a video for you guys if you're interested, if you haven't seen it already, which is this one. This is what it looks like. This is how the US beats China. It's on the channel. Please check it out if you're interested in this, because this is where I just speculate a little bit about what the real strategy might be around Ukraine. So we know that the Americans know that China is the real challenge for them, and yet they're involved in the conflict in Ukraine with Russia. They're pushing towards conflict with Iran. It makes you think there must just be some other ulterior motives for those conflicts going on, if actually Bill Burns, the CIA director, has stated that the real focus, the real challenge is going to be China. Anyhow, that's a lot of me waffling tonight, but I needed to get a video out, and I had the opportunity to do it this evening. So I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have enjoyed it, please share it with people. I'm really trying to get the channel to grow. If you like the channel, please subscribe. But yeah, feel free to jump on X or Insta or Telegram or wherever it is that you hang out, and to people that you think would enjoy the channel, send them the link. I'd love it. Thank you. Bye.